Hello cruel world, my name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. So Stockholm Syndrome, you've probably heard of it. What is it? Why is it? What is possibly the most well-known case? And what are the psychological processes behind it? And why would a victim of sexual abuse lie on behalf of the perpetrator? I'm going to answer all of these questions and many, many more in this very episode of The Psych for Sore Minds. So sit back, relax, get your list of demands ready, and welcome to The Psych for Sore Minds. So Stockholm Syndrome is like the psychological response in a kidnap situation where the captive begins to identify closely with and has empathy and sometimes even romantic feelings for their captors. Generally, they also believe in the perpetrator's agenda and their demands and basically their whole philosophy. But crucially, they continue to feel this way after the event has passed. So it's more than just like a survival instinct. In this episode, I'm going to outline one of the most infamous, bizarre cases of Stockholm Syndrome, who is Patricia Hearst. She's an actress who was kidnapped and carried out armed robberies on behalf of her tormentors months after the incident. I'm also going to tell you where the name originated and a psychoanalysis of what it's all about. So lots of learning points in this episode. I educate while you vegetate. Is that a good tagline? I'm not really sure. Let me know in the comments. But basically what I'm saying is by the end of this episode, you're going to be even more cleverer than you are now. But obviously not as clever as me. So Stockholm Syndrome, the name derived from a botched bank robbery in Stockholm in August 1973. So Stockholm, as you'll probably know, is the capital of Sweden, which is a country full of tall, beautiful, blonde people. It only has 6 hours of summer in the winter and it's ranked the best marathon in the world. It also hosts the annual Nobel Prize ceremonies, which is actually where I was presented with the Nobel Prize for YouTubing last year. Or did I maybe dream that? I'm not sure. What happened was that 4 bank employees were held hostage in the bank's vault for 6 days, and this bond developed between the captors and the captives. And one hostage even begged the Swedish Prime Minister, with a very Swedish sounding name, Olof Palme, to go easy on the captors. And some of the hostages even refused to testify against them in court. But perhaps the most infamous case, one that I'm just about to tell you about, is of Patricia Hearst, an actress who's also known as Patty. So Patty was born on the 20th of February 1954, which means that she's got the same birthday as Kurt Cobain, my favourite South African comedian Trevor Noah, and Rihanna, who was recently declared the world's first billionaire female musician. Personally, I find Rihanna's voice a little bit grating, to be honest. Rihanna, if you're watching this, I'm willing to let that slide. Get in touch. So Patty's grandfather was William Hearst, and he was this huge American publishing magnate. So it's a rich family, ideal target for a kidnapping. Patty was the third of 5 daughters. She was born in San Francisco and grew up in California. And she attended Berkeley University, and she lived with her fiance, who was called Stephen Weed, which is a perfect student name, really. On February 4th, 1974, 19-year-old Patty was kidnapped from her apartment. And a left-wing urban guerrilla group called the Symbionese Liberation Army took her. They're shortened to the SLA, which is not to be mistaken for the SLA, the School Library Association, which is based in the UK, and they believe that every pupil is entitled to effective school library provision, much less extreme agenda, much less of a kind of murderous vibe. So this group demanded that the Hearst family use their political ties to free certain guerrilla members who had been arrested for a previous killing. And they also demanded that the family distributed $70 million worth of food to every Californian. And Patsy's father took out a loan and he arranged the immediate donation of $2 million worth of food. So according to Patty's testimony, she was held with her hands tied and the leader repeatedly threatened her with death. She was let out for meals and she was blindfolded whilst this happened, and she was given the group's political agenda to memorise. Obviously, the blindfold wouldn't come off for that bit. And she was given a choice: either she'd be killed or she would have to join the SLA. And during the trial, she said, and I quote, I accommodated my thoughts to coincide with theirs, and that's really important as it ties in with the definition of Stockholm Syndrome that I will tell you about later. However, she also gave a different account at a later date, and she said that she was offered the choice of being released or joining the SLA. And it's a very important distinction when it comes to Stockholm Syndrome. So Patty agreed to join them and was given daily lessons, including weapons drills, and was also reportedly sexually abused, including by William Harris, who's the leader of the SLA, and he's an integral character later on in the story, so remember that name. So 2 months after she was abducted, she announced on tape that she had joined the SLA. She'd taken the name Tanya. So this is where things get really insalubrious. And for those of you with a limited vocabulary, that basically means juicy. So Patty was released on the 15th of April 1974, and later the same month, she seemingly voluntarily participated in a bank robbery in San Francisco on behalf of this SLA group. And she was seen holding up a machine gun and yelling, "I'm Tanya, up against the wall!" Language Tanya. In the trial, the prosecution and defence, they argued about whether she was actually a volunteer or a reluctant participant in the robbery. And I'm sure we can all relate to that because it's literally the plot line of the film, Point Break. Pappas, Angelo Pappas, punk, quarterback punk. So there was some indication that Patty was being threatened during the robbery. So for example, she had guns pointed at her. However, she was actually indicted for the robbery during her trial, but we'll come back to that later. So in a bizarre incident the next month, which is May 1974, the manager of a sporting goods store in Inglewood, California, and if you listen to 90s hip hop like I do, it seems like quite a rough spot. Inglewood! The manager of the store saw a minor theft being carried out by that man, William Harris, the leader of the SLA, who had indoctrinated Patty. And so Harris was shopping with his wife, and Patty was waiting outside in a van across the road. So the manager, he confronts Harris and they have a small scuffle. The gun clatters out of William Harris's waistband onto the floor. Patty picks up the gun and fires it overhead to cause a distraction, which I'm pretty sure also happened in Point Break. And she did this, and then she, along with Harris and his wife, they hijacked 2 cars and they abducted the owners in the cars. And they even had a massive police chase and a standoff, and the police surrounded the main base of the SLA, and there's a big shootout, and some of the members of the SLA actually died during that shootout. So pretty serious stuff. And I have to say that this kind of throws me, because up until this point, you could argue that Patty was under duress, during the bank robbery, for example. But clearly this was voluntary, because presumably she would have had the opportunity to escape, because I know I have in all my police shootouts. Patty helped make improvised explosive devices, and these were used in 2 unsuccessful attempts to kill police in August 1975. And she was also the getaway driver for at least 1 other robbery. So when arrested, Patty wrote down her occupation as urban guerrilla. And she asked her attorney to read out the following message. Pay attention, because this is important. "Tell everyone that I'm smiling and that I feel strong, and I send my greetings and love to all the sisters and brothers out there." So to me, we're not getting the picture of somebody who is being coerced, who is under death threats, or who is coerced or is under death threats to commit one particular bank robbery. To me, it sounds like somebody who's been indoctrinated. So it kind of sounds a little bit like a filthy hippie, no offense. So as a quick side note, and to give you some insights as my job as a forensic psychiatrist, there is a fair correlation between people who are persuadable and having a low IQ. So for example, when I take on work in criminal cases, sometimes I've seen people who have a low IQ who are exploited. So for example, a drug gang might take them under the wing, make them work in a county line, and they kind of befriend these people with low IQs, get them to take all the risk, and they reap all the benefits. And in my profession, I have sometimes had to give expert opinions on whether somebody is suggestible or vulnerable. And as I say, there is a correlation. However, Patty was way over average intelligence. Her IQ has actually been tested to be 130. Although interestingly, it was retested again during her trial, and it dropped 18 points. So it's measured at 112. Incidentally, your IQ has increased by 18 points just by listening to my dulcet tones. So the court case was convoluted, it was complicated, with some professionals, including psychiatrists, saying that Patty had been coerced and brainwashed, and others saying that it was all voluntary. Oddly, Patty herself seemed not to really be particularly cooperative with the process. She seemed a bit sedated, which could have been related to the medication she was given in prison. Which in itself is a bit weird to me, because why would you over-medicate somebody unless she was extremely agitated or acutely unwell at the time, although there was no evidence of this. So in March 1976, Patty was convicted of bank robbery and also of using firearms. So oddly, the judge actually died before he could pass a sentence on to Patty. So another judge determined the sentence and gave her 7 years. Honestly, this is starting to get a bit kind of soap opera-y for me, and so many random things just happening out of the blue. Are you not entertained? And in prison, Patty had a collapsed lung which prevented her from testifying against William Harris and other SLA members, including for crimes that she also was charged with. So it's all very complex. She was given a pardon after 22 months by President Jimmy Carter, though she was still released on probation. Later, the probation was cancelled and she was given a full pardon by none other than Bill Clinton, who did not have sexual relations with that woman in 2001 on his very last day in office. As if this couldn't get even more ludicrous and surreal, 2 months after her release, Patty married a man called Bernard Shaw, a policeman who was part of her security detail whilst she was on bail. So Patty is actually is a professional actress, and she's quite successful. She's appeared in a number of Hollywood films, which, to be honest, I've never really heard of. There's Cry Baby and Serial Mom. If you guys have heard of that, any of these films, tell me about them in the comments. Are they any good? Let me know. Okay, my peoples. I will now tell you a bit about the psychology behind Stockholm Syndrome, because this is my expertise. So before that, can you guess the percentage of kidnapped situations where Stockholm Syndrome occurs? Answers at the end of this episode. So Stockholm Syndrome, by definition, is when captives feel the opposite of the fear and disdain towards their captors, which outsiders, yourself, myself, might expect. And there are a few key components. First of all, the hostage develops a positive feeling towards the captor. More than that, they actually buy into the agenda. There has to be no previous relationships, so they have to be strangers. There has to be a refusal of the hostages to cooperate with authorities or to get the captors in trouble. All of these are relevant in Patty's case. So in terms of the psychological theory, the bond is initially created when a captor threatens the life of the captive and then deliberates. So then they choose not to kill them. So the person who's held captive has an intense relief and feelings of gratitude, and the victim's desire to survive and to please the captor intensifies and solidifies over the next few days of being held hostage. And in theory, because the experience is so intense, even minor acts of kindness in the midst of all these horrible conditions and in this, fear of death, is perceived as being really good treatment. So these emotions are encoded and they continue way past the experience. So the victim then makes psychological links between the captor's happiness and their own happiness. So not only is there a positive psychological bond between the captor and captive, but they also take on the negative attitudes towards authority. So emotions are encoded and continue way past the experience. And they make psychological links between the captor's happiness and their own. So not only is there a positive psychological bond between the captor and the captive, but they also take on the negative attitudes towards authorities or people or anyone who tries to break up the relationship, such as the police trying to arrest the perpetrators or judges trying to sentence them to prison. Okay kids, so can you think of different versions of where these psychological processes that I'm talking about might be seen? Does it seem familiar to you in any way? I hope so, because you would also see this with domestic violence, you might see it with cult members or prisoners of war, and also with abused children. So in all these situations, there is an emotional paradox, which is the same as what happens in Stockholm Syndrome. So the victims are either being sympathetic towards or even protective towards the apparent perpetrator, who might be physically or even sexually abusive towards them. So for me personally, out of all of these situations, it's easiest to understand in the context of a child and their abuser. Because at such a young age, you're still developing your emotions and your bonds, and children might crave attention, they might crave love, boundaries and nurture, and maybe they're not getting it from anybody else. Also, sexually abused children often feel flattered by adult attention because they're too young to fully appreciate that it's wrong, and they're scared of disclosing this to other people because it might create family disruption, or the family might even be broken up. So to me, it kind of reminds me of the Finding Neverland documentary, where a man called Wade Robson, who's now an Australian dancer and choreographer, gave testimony. So Michael Jackson befriended Robson as a child. And when Jackson was first charged with child sexual offences, Robson was interviewed by the police, and he said, and I quote, "He wouldn't do anything like that, I know that for a fact." Years later, during the 2005 Michael Jackson trial, he would go under oath stating that Jackson never touched him inappropriately. But then, in 2013, Robson reportedly filed a $1.5 billion civil lawsuit against the Jackson estate, saying that Jackson had abused him consistently from when Robson was a child between the ages of 7 and 14. So many people have come out and said automatically they've made the assumption that Robson was dishonest and he was lying now for money, and that he can't be believed, and that there's no reason why he would lie on behalf of Michael Jackson. It doesn't make any sense. Personally, I found the Finding Neverland documentary quite convincing. Obviously, I can't say for definite that he's definitely telling the truth. I'm not going to stand there and say that. But I do think there are at least viable reasons. There are at least psychological explanations why he might have lied on behalf of Michael Jackson when he was younger. Such as, for example, when he was a young child, he was shown all this attention, all this affection. And it's very possible that Robson got confused with boundaries related to sex. And he also potentially had a friend who was a superstar, so he would have been desperate for this relationship to continue and terrified of it ending. It would have been the biggest, most exciting thing that happened to him in his life up until that point. So basically what I'm saying is there's similar psychological processes potentially to Stockholm Syndrome. And even in the case of Patty Hearst, it might not be explicable or logical, and it might not be easy to understand for you and I. But my question is this: how would you know? You might think you know what it's like to be in that kind of situation, but you've never actually been in it. Psychological damage of believing that you're close to death for a prolonged period of time can warp what a typical and normal thought process is. What I'm saying is the mind is a complicated beast. So, dear viewers, did you get the percentage of Stockholm Syndrome in kidnapping and in hostages? Before I tell you, I'm going to introduce you to this channel. So you're watching A Sight for Sore Minds, your one-stop shop to learn about mental illness and criminality and offending. So I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders in prisons and in courts and in secure units. That's what I do professionally. I act as an expert witness in criminal trials. This channel covers a whole range of topics, some related to offending, some related to mental illness. Sometimes I interview ex-patients. I talk about high-profile true crime cases with my own personal psychoanalysis. I talk about individual diagnoses. Basically what I'm saying is there's something for everybody on this channel. Generally speaking, the Tuesday episodes like this one are a deep dive into one case. The Friday episodes are a bit casual and they're less scripted. And also sometimes I talk about my own personal cases, which is my USP. I anonymise them out of respect for patient confidentiality. So please subscribe, because not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it actually improves your reverse parking, so you're not going back and forth and embarrassing yourself like a complete idiot like you usually do. Okay, so the proportion of Stockholm Syndrome in kidnap hostage situations is, drumroll please, about 5%. So it's actually very rare. So if you, dear viewer, said or guessed between 3 and 10%, you have my respect, you have my permission to buy yourself a cookie. I would stress that although it's a recognised syndrome, it's not a specific diagnosis. For example, it doesn't exist in ICD-10 or DSM. So that might sound contradictory, but ICD and DSM are like for formal diagnoses, whereas a syndrome, basically anybody can make up a syndrome if it's a collection of symptoms. It doesn't necessarily have to be recognised, but obviously some syndromes are. So Stockholm Syndrome and other similar emotional paradoxes might not be explicable or logical or easily understandable, and you might know what it'd be like to cope with such prolonged stress, but you actually don't really know what it's like. So I hope this is a warning in case you are ever kidnapped at gunpoint or held hostage in a bank robbery, because a couple of psychological processes down the line, and you never know, you might be the one that turns into an actual criminal. Dun, dun, dun. So before I finish, I just want to tell you that I'm going to be part of CrimeCon UK, a huge true crime convention which is coming over to the UK for the first time ever in London on the 25th, 26th of September. You've still got time to copy tickets. Use the code PSYCH to get 10% off. You will hear from investigative journalists, law enforcement agents, podcasters, basically everybody who's anybody in the world of true crime. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be doing a talk about two real-life cases of patients. Two real-life cases of patients I've assessed who actually killed their own family members. One of them was mentally ill at the time, one of them wasn't. All that remains for me to say is, please tell everybody that you ever meet for the rest of your life about this channel. Stay euthymic and do not forget.